On the 15th of January, 1986, a crowd of about 200 people walked through a machine tool factory in Gardena, California, and bought it piece by piece. It took 3 auctioneers an entire day to move them through the building. The company was called Burgmaster. For a stretch of the 20th century, it was the largest machine tool builder west of the Mississippi, and the drill it invented in a Los Angeles garage sat on shop floors across America, cutting the metal that everything else was made from. When it died, the country was handed a familiar set of reasons. The Japanese were dumping. American labor cost too much. The technology had moved on. Every one of those reasons was true enough to believe. That was the trick. Because Burgmaster was not destroyed by anything built overseas. It was destroyed by a signature on a piece of paper in New York, 7 years before the auctioneers arrived. A kind of deal so new that most of the country had never heard its name. And to understand what actually happened in Gardena, you only need to follow 3 letters. You are watching Trade Archive. If stories like this one deserve your attention, like this video and subscribe before we go on. That is what keeps the archive growing. Now, let us begin. Fred Burg was born in Czechoslovakia in 1896, and he was working as a locksmith's boy by the age of 10. Machines were the first language he ever loved. He came to America in 1911, 15 years old, and went almost straight onto the floor of an international harvester plant as a lathe operator, standing in the noise and the cutting oil, learning what metal would give and what it would not. Then, life did to him what it does to nearly everyone. He married, and his in-laws owned a dry goods business, and for the next 2 decades Fred Burg sold fabric and household goods, and kept his hands busy inventing things in the evenings, in whatever spare hours a store manager gets. By 1943, he had worked his way up to managing a department store in Chicago. A secure job. A respectable job. And somewhere in the crush of that year's Christmas shopping season, at the age of 47, he decided he could not do it anymore. He quit, uprooted his family, and moved them to Los Angeles, into the roaring wartime economy of Southern California. People came to Los Angeles to get into pictures. Fred Burg came to get back to machines. Within months, he had patented a fist-sized tool holding device he called the Tool Flex, a gadget that let a lathe operator machine precise holes far faster than before, and he was manufacturing it out of his garage. He was the inventor, the machinist, and the traveling salesman, all in one body. In 1944, that garage operation became the Burg Tool Manufacturing Company. When his son Joe and his son-in-law Norman Ginsberg came home from the Army in 1945, Fred made them partners. The 3 families lived under one roof on Detroit Street in Hollywood. The 3 men drove together every morning to a little shop at 67th and San Pedro, ate the sandwiches their wives had made, and worked 6-day weeks. Fred taught and sold. Norman learned to turn out tool flexes on a lathe. Joe drafted the designs. Fred's daughter Blanche kept the books at the kitchen table. Then, in 1946, out on the road selling his tool holders, Fred Burg had the idea that would carry his name into 1,000 factories. He went home, pulled the turret off an old lathe, and started building a prototype for a new kind of drilling machine. He was too poor to order proper castings from a foundry, so he welded scraps of metal together and shaped the frame himself. What emerged looked like an ordinary drill press, except for the strange rotating head in the middle, radiating tools in 6 directions. Understand what a drill press was in 1946, and you understand why this mattered. 1 spindle, 1 tool. Drill your hole, stop the machine, crank the bit out, fit the tap or the reamer, line everything up again, and start over. Every part that needed 5 operations needed 5 setups, and every setup was minutes of skilled labor that produced nothing. Fred Burg's turret drill held 6 tools at once and rotated each into position in sequence. Drill, ream, countersink, tap, one after another, without ever unclamping the part. On some jobs, it cut machining time by a third. It brought a kind of automation to the ordinary neighborhood job shop, the small customers, the big Eastern machine tool builders, never bothered with. The first production model went to Beckman Instruments in Pasadena, late in 1946. And here is a detail I keep coming back to, because it tells you who these people were. The early machines broke down constantly. Hardly a week passed without one of the Burgs driving out to Pasadena to fix the thing with their own hands. They did not hide from the failure. They lived at the customer's elbow until the machine ran right. Fred never doubted the concept for a moment, and the family bet the entire company on it, farming out their profitable tool flex orders to free up their own machines for the drill. The BET paid for itself many times over. Machine tools are a famously cruel business, boom and bust, feast and famine, but Burgmaster seemed to slip the cycle. When the economy grew, factories bought Burgmasters to expand. When it shrank, they bought Burgmasters to cut costs. The Korean War retooling of the early 50s poured orders through the door. In 1954, the company built its own plant in Gardena for about $70,000, with a ceiling hoist so Fred could build bigger models, and posted revenue of $574,000 with 62 employees. By 1965, Burgmaster employed around 275 people and sold roughly $8 to $9 million of machines a year. The largest machine tool builder west of the Mississippi, grown from a welded-together prototype in a garage. Walk that Gardena floor in its good years, and you would have understood the secret without anyone explaining it. The smell of cutting oil hanging in the air, sweet and mineral at once, soaked so deep into a machinist's hands that no soap ever fully got it out. The bright curl of a steel chip peeling off a part and dropping, still smoking, into the tray. The chatter of a dozen spindles proving out at once, a sound the older men could read like weather, picking out the one bearing in the building that was starting to go. Building a machine tool is not like stamping out toasters. Every casting has to be scraped and fitted by hand, every spindle trued to tolerances finer than a human hair. Because this machine's job is to make other machines, and every error in it multiplies into everything it will ever touch. The men who could do that work carried years of judgment in their fingertips, and they knew what they were worth. And moving through all of it, the owners themselves, men who had run these machines with their own hands. Fred still walked the floor. Joe still bent over the drawings. The Burgs used numbers the way a machinist uses a micrometer, as a measure and a guide, never as the point of the exercise. Foremen sat in on production scheduling and argued back when a schedule was wrong. The men on the floor were treated as the company's edge, because they were. Ben Bezjetsky, the general foreman, put the whole culture in one sentence. If Fred was going to spend a nickel, they were going to make a quarter. That was the company in 1965. Profitable, respected, inventive, and family-owned. Which is precisely when the trouble started. Because Burgmaster had grown to the edge of what a family could finance, and it needed capital to keep growing. In October of 1965, the Burgs sold the company to Hudal Industries, a Buffalo, New York conglomerate named for a French engineer who had patented a hydraulic shock absorber. Hudal owned auto parts plants, construction materials, pumps, and a growing collection of machine tool firms. Its chief executive, Gerald Saltarelli, was buying companies the way other men bought stocks. At first, almost nothing changed. That is how it always begins. Then, gradually, the Burgs and their key people were eased out, and in their place came layers of managers and accountants, hardly any of whom had ever stood at a machine or knew the first thing about building one. They spent their days producing reports, budgets, and forecasts for a head office 2,000 miles away. The number stopped being a guide and became the entire purpose. Foremen who had once helped plan production were now simply handed schedules from a new production control department and told to hit them. The older employees noticed something small and telling. The new managers did not spend much time on the floor, and they were certainly not going to get their hands dirty. A line began to run through the middle of the building that had never been there before. White collars on one side, blue collars on the other, and year by year it widened. The company was still called Burgmaster. The sign out front had not changed. But the thing that had made it Burgmaster, owners who knew the machines, was being managed out of it one retirement at a time. Nobody smashed anything. That is worth sitting with for a moment. There was no villain on the floor, no single day you could point to. Nobody murdered the company in 1965. They placed it on a slow drip, and the drip was paperwork. About 2 years after the sale, Saltarelli looked at Burgmaster's order backlog, which by the company's own description was big enough to choke a horse, and decided the problem was Joe Burg. Too much salesman, not enough production man. So Joe Burg was promoted sideways into international sales. Into the president's chair went Tom Norton, a longtime Hudal executive. For the first time in its existence, Burgmaster was run by a man who knew almost nothing about machine tools. Then came the computer. Head office imposed a computerized production scheduling system on the plant, an early version of what the textbooks call materials requirements planning. It was built for simpler products, and it was far too crude for the thousands of parts and endless custom variations of machine tool work. The shop floor knew it would fail. The shop floor was not asked. Parts arrived in the wrong order, schedules collapsed, costs climbed, and delivery dates slid. Business schools still teach the Burgmaster scheduling disaster today, as a case study in what happens when a system designed in a distant office is forced onto a factory it does not understand. And while the company was choking on its own paperwork, the industry around it was turning over. Out of an Air Force-funded lab at MIT had come numerical control, machines guided by coded instructions instead of a machinist's hands, and by the 60s, it was maturing into computer numerical control. This was the future arriving on schedule, and Burgmaster's answer to it was a heartbreak. Fred Burg, aging now but still certain, championed a machine called the 20T, a monster that replaced the 6-tool turret with 20 tools and 20 spindles arranged around a rotating drum. He insisted it would hold better accuracy than the new machining centers. It took 4 years to design. And then, out in the field, the flaw surfaced. The drum was so massive that after a few months of hard running, it could no longer hold tolerance. The founder's boldest bet, and his first great mistake, arrived exactly when the company could least afford one. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, competitors were doing something almost offensively simple. They were building standardized, reliable CNC machines, all running the same FANUC controls, and shipping them in weeks. American builders quoted custom machines with custom controllers and delivery times stretching past a year. There is a story from those years about a Pennsylvania company that ordered a $50,000 American grinder and was told to wait 12 months. Instead, it got 2 Japanese grinders, delivered within weeks, for nearly the same money. The men on the Gardena floor could feel the ground shifting long before headquarters admitted it. Orders got harder. Margins got thinner. The answer from upstairs stayed the same. Next year would be better. Next year was not better. And then New York called. By the late 1970s, Hudal itself had a problem. Its stock drifted below the value of the assets behind it, around $14.50 a share, and Saltarelli, nearing retirement, feared a hostile raider. Into that anxiety walked 3 financiers who had left Bear Stearns to start their own small firm in 1976. Jerome Kohlberg, Henry Kravis, George Roberts, Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts. KKR. The three letters from the beginning of this story. In 1979, they were not the empire they would become. They were three men with a small office and an idea. And the idea, as it was pitched to an aging chief executive worried about raiders, amounted to this: you can have your cake and eat it too. Sell the company, protect it from hostile hands, reward every shareholder, walk away rich, and nothing on the factory floor has to change. What they proposed had never been done to a large public American corporation. Nothing worth more than $100 million had ever been taken private with borrowed money. Hyundai was worth several times that. In May of 1979, they did it anyway, taking the company private in what was called a leveraged buyout, paying shareholders $40 a share, nearly triple the market price, in a deal worth roughly $355 million. Some accounts put it closer to 390. And here is the mechanism, because the mechanism is the whole story. Of that enormous purchase price, the buyers put up about $48 million in equity. More than $300 million was borrowed from banks and insurance companies, and every dollar of that debt was loaded onto Hyundai itself. KKR, the firm arranging it all, put in about $1 million of its own money. The company was used to buy the company. The prize paid for its own capture. Management was cut in, of course. Executives and employees were allowed to buy 8% of the new shares for about $2 million, which meant the men running Hyundai now had a personal fortune riding not on how many machines Gardena shipped, but on how much cash could be squeezed out of it and up to the lenders. Every incentive in the building had just been turned to face away from the factory. Why would any lender go along with it? Because of a silent partner in the deal, the United States Treasury. By taking Hyundai private, revaluing its assets, depreciating them all over again, and deducting the interest on that mountain of debt, the new owners could arrange for a profitable industrial company to pay little or no federal income tax for years. The cash that once went to the government and to new machines would go to the banks instead. A future Treasury Secretary would later describe takeover premiums as being ground out of exactly that mill, the swap of taxable income for deductible interest. Everyone at the top was taken care of. Saltarelli retired with a package worth around $5 million. Phil O'Reilly, the former Purdue football lineman who took over as chief executive, was promised a raise from $110,000 to $200,000 before bonuses. On Wall Street, the Hyundai filings landed like a lit match. One buyout financier later recalled that every firm on the street grabbed the documents and, in his words, said, "Holy mackerel, look at this." They had all just watched someone buy a public industrial giant with borrowed money and a tax break. Leveraged buyout activity in America went from about $1.3 billion in 1979 to $77 billion by 1988. KKR itself would go on to Beatrice and then to RJR Nabisco, the deal they made a book and a movie about. Barbarians at the Gate. The gate they first walked through was Hyundai's, which means the gate was Gardena's, because down at the bottom of that tower of debt, in a factory in California, the arithmetic of daily life had quietly been rewritten. A normal company that hits a rough year has choices. It can invest through the downturn, lean on its equity, play the long game the Burgs had always played. A leveraged company has one job that comes before every other job: service the debt. So cash stopped flowing into the plant and started flowing out of it. Capital investment withered. And under relentless pressure to book revenue, Burgmaster began doing things the Burgs would never have tolerated. It shipped machines it knew were defective. It promised customers features its engineers had not even designed yet. A company built on a family driving to Pasadena every week to make one machine run right was now pushing broken ones out the door to make a quarterly number. The machines stopped being the point. The machines had become the collateral. When the reckoning finally came for Hyundai, its answer would have baffled Fred Burg. Instead of hiring engineers, it hired lawyers. In 1981, the American economy fell into the deepest recession since the war, and the machine tool industry fell off a cliff. Industry sales collapsed from $5 billion in 1981 to $2 billion by 1983. Japanese machining centers, 4% of the American market in 1976, had taken roughly half of it by 1981 and kept climbing. For a debt-loaded Hyundai, this was mortal danger. And so, in the spring of 1982, Hyundai went to Washington. Its lawyer, Richard Kopackin of the white shoe firm Covington & Burling, built a petition asking President Reagan to invoke an obscure, never-used provision of a 1971 tax law and strip the investment tax credit from anyone buying certain Japanese machine tools. The claim was that Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry had organized its machine tool makers into a cartel that was unfairly targeting the American market. The brief ran to 714 pages and cost about $500,000. All told, Hyundai spent nearly $750,000 on the campaign, on lawyers, researchers, and public relations men. Money that could have bought engineering hours and new designs went instead to Washington to fight for a rule change. Think about what the plant in Gardena could have done with $750,000 in 1982. The campaign was loud, and for a moment it worked. In December of 1982, the Senate passed a unanimous resolution urging the president to act. But inside the administration, the free traders pushed back. The trade representative was skeptical of the cartel evidence, and Reagan let the petition die in 1983. Here is the bitter joke buried inside that fight. Hyundai's whole case was that Japan won through conspiracy. But you have already heard how Japan actually won. While Hyundai's men argued about Tokyo in front of cameras, the customers had already voted, quietly, with purchase orders. The trade fight was one more act of engineering, just not the kind done at a drafting table. Financial engineering, political engineering, anything but the machines. After the petition failed, the end came almost as a formality. On the 24th of September, 1985, Hyundai announced a restructuring that would shed 7 divisions, its entire machine tool group among them. 1 week later, on the 1st of October, it announced that Burgmaster would close. There was a last scramble to link the plant with a Japanese partner. It failed. And on the 15th of January, 1986, the auctioneers arrived in Gardena, and we are back where we began. The 200 people filing past the lot numbers, veterans of the old company finding each other in the crowd, gray now, shaking hands in the aisles where they had once fitted spindles, so many of them that the auction turned into a reunion. Men who had given the place 20 and 30 years stood and watched strangers bid on the tools they had worked with, the way you might watch someone go through your father's garage. And behind the rope, the 2 crippled machines that could not be made to run, and beside them, the 4 gleaming Japanese turret drills, sitting on the floor of the factory that had invented the turret drill, waiting to be sold to its customers. Nobody planned that last detail. Nobody would have dared write it. The whole 40-year argument, the petition, the 714 pages, the press conferences about Japanese conspiracies, answered silently by 4 machines standing on the concrete where Fred Burg's hoist used to swing. Fred Burg was still alive that day. He was 90 years old and too ill to attend, and the family made a decision. They never told him his factory was being auctioned. He died in 1995, at 98, spared the ending. Across Hyundai's machine tool group, some 2,200 skilled, well-paid jobs disappeared. The machinists mostly found other work. The capacity to build machines never came back. And Hyundai itself? The buyout that started it all had turned out, in Wall Street's own vernacular, to be a dog. So in 1986, the insiders ran the trick again. a second leveraging that cashed out the original investors at $11 for shares they had bought at $2.52, while pushing debt past 150% of the company's capital and its bonds deep into junk. Within about a year, the remains were sold off to a British group, and by September of 1987, Hudile Industries, the company that had swallowed Burgmaster to grow strong, no longer existed either. The men who arranged all of it did fine. Burgmaster made its own mistakes, and they were not small. The 20T fiasco was pure Gardena, conceived by Fred Burg himself, and it burned 4 irreplaceable years. Economists who studied the industry's collapse, including a major RAND study, found American builders as a class were complacent, hooked on the protected domestic market, and slow to grasp what standardized CNC would mean. One machinist, reviewing this history years later, put it bluntly: American builders failed to grasp the possibilities of CNC, and you cannot pin that on a buyout firm. Businessweek's own reviewer of the Burgmaster story argued the deeper disease was a failure to innovate, the same disease that gutted Detroit. All of that is true. Then notice the thing none of it can explain. Complacency did not sign a term sheet loading $300 million of debt onto a factory. A trade cartel, real or imagined, did not decide to ship defective machines to hit a quarterly number. And no Japanese engineer ever voted to spend Burgmaster's last spare cash on 714 pages of legal argument instead of a new machine. Those were decisions. They were made in rooms, by men. The recession and the imports were the weather. The debt was a choice. A vulnerable company can survive bad weather. A vulnerable company stripped of its reserves, bled for interest, and run for cash cannot survive anything. A journalist named Max Holland understood this better than anyone alive because his father spent 29 years as a machinist at Burgmaster. And Holland kept insisting on one point that sounded almost quaint in 1989 and sounds like a warning siren now. Machine tools are the mother machines. They are the machines that make every other machine, the trucks and the turbines and the artillery. A nation that loses them does not just lose an industry, it loses the ability to rebuild every other industry. In 1940, machine tools were the very first export America embargoed against Japan because both countries understood exactly what they were. Between 1982 and 1987, roughly half of America's machine tool companies closed. Not the worst half either. Good firms and bad firms went down together, because when an industry loses its capital, its customers, and its confidence at the same time, quality stops being what decides who survives. A country that had led the world in machine tool production entering the 1980s fell to 4th or 5th, and it has stayed there. By 1986, 3/4 of the numerically controlled machines sold in America were imported, and Washington, having refused Hudile, quietly negotiated import restraints anyway, on national security grounds, in 1986. The Pentagon had finally noticed what it was losing. Too late for Gardena. There is even a strange little coda. In early 2026, 40 years after the auction, the Burgmaster name itself was revived, attached through a merger to a modern American additive manufacturing firm trading on the old company's machining heritage. A brand resurrected as a memory of competence. The name survived. The thing the name meant did not. Stand today where the Burgmaster plant stood, in the flat industrial grid of Gardena, and there is nothing to see. Warehouses, truck lots, traffic on the 110. But here and there across America, in small job shops, 50-year-old Burgmaster drills are still running, still holding tolerance, outliving the company, outliving the conglomerate, outliving the deal. Machinists trade tips online about keeping them alive. The machines, it turns out, were never the weak part. Nobody should call what happened here a death from natural causes. Burgmaster was starved by a distant owner, mortgaged by men who never touched it, bled to pay for its own purchase, and then sold off by the pound, while the country was told it was all just Japan, all just wages, all just the times. If this story landed with you, do 2 things before you go. Subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments about a company your town lost the same way. The next video is already on screen. See you there.